Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first event of the spring semester for the Frankie program. I'm Priya Natarajan. I happen to be the current director of the Frankie program in Science and the Humanities, which, as you all know, is Yale's flagship interdisciplinary program. We have a very exciting roster of events for this semester. And today we have a very special event, one that charts a personal intellectual journey across disciplines by Dr. Andrew Ko. But first, I would like to thank our benefactors, Mr. and Mrs. Richard and Barbara Frankie, whose generosity enables both activities at the Frankie program, today's event, as well as many other interdisciplinary activities at Yale. And before I introduce Dr. Ko, I'm required to give you this notice that Yale University is photographing and videotaping this event. There's a possibility that you may be included in these visuals. By being present during these activities, you consent to the use of your appearance, likeness, and voice by Yale for standard nonprofit educational news-related promotional and/or editorial purposes. And before I forget, as per usual, after today's talk and the Q&A, we will be gathering for a dinner reception upstairs in the student lounge immediately after this event. So on to today's event. I am delighted that we have today as our speaker, Dr. Andrew Ko, who is an archaeologist and who is an ancient historian with a strong interest in pharmacology and medicine, with a focus on ancient innovation and technology, and other discoveries and new knowledge that was generated in antiquity that we are able to study today with modern techniques. He is the museum scientist for the Yale Peabody Museum, and he's a faculty member in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations and the Council on Archaeological Studies. He's an active field archaeologist who is the PI of the Southern Focused Regional Project in Greece and Yale's Ancient Pharmacology Program at the Peabody Museum. Before I turn over the floor to him, I just wanted to mention a couple of upcoming events. Tomorrow, January 25th, although it's not our event, but it may be of interest to many of you, is a panel discussion called Beyond Human Meaning, a conversation with Professor Gary Tumlinson on the subject of his new book of the same title. And on Tuesday, March 26th, we have a screening of Richland, a new documentary on a small town that's struggling with its identity as a center of weapons-grade plutonium production. And on April 4th, we have a talk by Christian Cooper, the victim of the Central Park birdwatching incident, who's an avid bird watcher, and he'll be talking to us about that. And we have a talk by Professor Meredith Broussard on big data and the race, gender, and ability bias that is embedded in big data. And then we have a talk by Professor Anjan Bhullar on the main scientific consultants. He was one of the main scientific consultants for the documentary series that many of you might have seen, Life on Our Planet. Anyway, back to today's event. I am really delighted to invite Dr. Andrew Ko to come and talk to us. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you. Welcome everybody on this sort of a rainy day. Thanks to the director Priya, and I think Ty is somewhere in the back, and the Frankie family. As I mentioned to them, it makes me exceedingly happy that this Frankie program exists, because that's going to be kind of like the theme of my time with you today, is kind of the journey I've taken. Spoiler alert, as somebody very in a kind sense said to me, I'm likely the squarest peg in academia with a lot of round holes. So I want to kind of share that journey and talk about what experiences I've had, and also perhaps it might be helpful for all the different and interesting people here. So I want to start our somewhat strange journey, if I can call it that. That was the alternate title, the Yale Ancient Pharmacology Program, Exploring Strange New Worlds. And you'll see here in a second it's relevant. It's my first time trying this. I'll preface it by saying I did not expect this ever. It was not on my bingo card, a bucket list, or anything like that. To the chagrin of some of my friends who are in fact diehard Trekkies, what happened was, let's say late 21, early 22, very much in the midst of the pandemic, I did an interview with a journalist you do these things, you don't know exactly what it's for, which sounds kind of naive in retrospect. He was in front of a fireplace, holed up in the cabin, and he said he was a writer, and he said he does a whole bunch of things, and this could be relevant to various things. So I had very little idea of what this was all about. What I did know is he asked me very particular and astute questions. What model of instruments do you use when you do your extractions? What do you think the past is, the present is? So I did this interview for almost 2 hours, which was the longest I've ever done one of these. And I thought maybe it'll appear in the magazine, as he intimated. And I didn't hear back from him until I was just back from my fieldwork in Greece, let's say July. He texts me, and I later found out it was him because I'd been with him on the phone, but I never received the text. So who knows what this text is all about, because all it said was, check out the latest episode of Star Trek. Was all it said. And in fact, I thought it was some kind of spam email from some kind of streaming unit or something like that. Later on, and again, this sounds strange, somehow in August or September, something jogged my memory and said, wait, was that the person who interviewed me many months ago? I checked, and indeed, it was that individual. So then I looked at the timestamp and I said, I didn't even have a subscription to the streaming service. So finally I said, I'll try that. And I looked, and to my surprise, not only did they include some kind of interpretation of it, but in the opening segment, as you'll see here, it basically sums up my research, at least as Dave interpreted it. So after I present my, directly what I've done the last, let's say, 20 years, I'll leave it up to you to see to judge how good of a job they did in terms of interpreting my work. Again, this was not on any kind of bucket list, and to my surprise, this happened. Just to preface it, this is the prequel to the original series, and in the original series, they threw out an occupation or discipline of a researcher, and it never plays a role significantly. And this discipline that they invented in the 60s in the original series, they dubbed archaeological medicine. And apparently they then, in more recent memory, said, oh shoot, we're doing this prequel that leads up to the original series. We actually got to nuance what this actually means. And now I think that's why they went to me. They somehow found me and said, you're the closest thing to this fictional future discipline. And to my surprise, again, this is apparently now Star Trek canon, to the chagrin of my friends who, when I showed it to one of my Trekkie friends up the hill, he was like, you don't even have a paid subscription to Paramount. This is offensive to me, right? So I have a paid subscription now, so this is the clip for 2 minutes. Of course it has my, here we go.
The log, stardate 1789.3. We're en route to the Vulcan system. Our mission? To survey the moon of Kirkov on the far side of the sector. An ancient civilization once lived there, then vanished. Long-range scans suggest the presence of a strange energy anomaly just above the surface. A few of us are hoping that it will provide answers about where the Kirkovians went. As for the rest of the crew, the captain has decided to travel at sub-impulse speeds so we can all take in the view. Now we find ourselves with an excess of the most valuable commodity in the galaxy.
I own one of those.
Downtime. I'm using it to prep for an interview for a 2-month fellowship sponsored by the Vulcan Science Academy.
What are Corby's 3 principles of archaeological medicine?
1, medicine is always ancient and new, as culture's understanding of what medicine is changes over time. 2, the keys to solving our toughest medical problems are often found by looking backward. Correct? 3, as a result, archaeological medicine is as much a study of history as it is of science. Drink.
All right, so that's believe it or not, it's literally the points I gave them for the most part. So again, something very unexpected. So now I'll actually share with you my research that actually references, they distilled into that 2-minute segment. Like I said, by many measures, I can say happily, I really shouldn't exist for reasons I'll detail in a second. I happily am doing what I'm doing. But there were many moments. When I was sitting there in the 90s at Abbott Labs, I didn't ever imagine I'll be sitting here in front of you talking about archaeology. So that's the journey I've been on, and it is amusing that somehow the Star Trek universe apparently wants me to exist, more than perhaps one would automatically presume. I want to start by conveying this simple premise. Simply enough, organics were central to ancient societies, but are now invisible. That's something we often forget when we think about archaeology. We have remnants that are displayed proudly on the cover of Archaeology magazine. Gold trinkets, vessels, beautiful funerary vases from southern Italy. What we don't know is for the ancients, it was what was inside of them typically, these kind of vessels. That was the most important thing. So we are in fact missing, for the most part, the entire reason for the existence of these vessels. We're getting the shells, right? The echoes of what really mattered often to these ancients. And for the longest time, we thought that we couldn't really access this information. There was a general sense that this was important, but we can't get to it. And perhaps as an ambitious graduate student, maybe in retrospect it was an exercise in hubris, but nevertheless, I thought, you know what? I want to give this a shot. I have a background. My undergraduate degree was in biophysics and also classics, ancient Near Eastern studies. So I want to bring that together, which is not easy because like in graduate school in Philadelphia, I had these two streams, but to kind of bring them together, as this audience would understand, it wasn't the easiest thing to do. So I want to share some of those experiences now. So how did I approach this conundrum of having really no organic surviving? So the approach as it's defined today is archaeochemistry. So what it is simply just the discovery of ancient organics and determining their relevance today. How are they different? How are they similar? So on and so forth. I'm always connecting it to the present and future, of course. And also utilizing a transdisciplinary method to characterize these ancient organic residues. Because these things are elusive, they're ethereal, right? And as you might know, as someone said, the chemistry doesn't lie, but we get these remnants of residues, compounds, organic compounds, and they can come from different sources, right? The interpretation is where we're fallible. And how we get to that, as you'll see, is what I'm calling this transdisciplinary method, where ancient texts, ancient iconography, all these different other clues kind of help us hone what the chemistry is telling us. And that's why it's important to do it in a very interdisciplinary manner, as fits what exactly this Frankie program is trying to support. And finally, why? Why do we do these things? We want to recover compelling evidence of what we're calling nonlinear innovation, technology, craft, etc. Because we know about how things kind of pass down to us. We can talk about Roman roads, and they're not that different from modern roads. But what particularly intrigues me is, are there instances where they might have stumbled upon something that, I say right off the bat, I'm not trying to find the cure for cancer, for instance. I don't have those kind of, aspirations necessarily. But what really intrigued me is one of the compounds I found was heavy doses of cinnamic acid, some aldehyde and other things. And when I did a search for them, I found out that they in fact identified the plant that I was targeting, a plant that only grows in today's, like, let's say, modern Southwest Turkey. And all the articles were medical, saying we're using these plants to try to research medical cancer treatments. So I thought that was fascinating. Like, what does this come to? How does this come to bear in terms of how we do this kind of research? So I don't think it's difficult to present to you that modern pharmacopoeia is actually still alive and kicking today in many ways, right? Things aren't all from a test tube. I was alerted to this because this might be outdated now. I'm not sure if Moroccan oil is still popular, but my significant other uses this. And what I caught is that, like, for instance, one of these smaller vessels to the left, it was like $80, right? So I was like, oh my gosh, this is $80. So I looked more into it because the background was very fascinating to me. And it's very interesting that, to show you how international it is, and it must have been similar in antiquity, it's a company if I remember correctly, it's a US company based in London who sources the botanical ingredients in Morocco, but manufactures it in the southern Levant of Israel. So again, showing you what is involved, right? A very complex situation. There's still abundant in value today, but what can we retrieve from antiquity, right? That was the million-dollar question. So it started almost exactly 20 years ago now, believe it or not. That's when I started my dissertation. And I'm calling it the beginnings being the Minoan Perfumed Oil Workshop. It's a very technical term amongst a very small group of scholars that work on Crete. If you guys know the legends of King Minos, so on and so forth, these are the archaeologists who specialize in this very particular time period of Bronze Age Greece. If you know Sir Arthur Evans, and many of you have probably been to Crete and Knossos, that's that culture and complex society. So I worked on an American site in East Crete that summer, and I wasn't trying to do archaeochemistry. In fact, at the moment, I was trying to do everything but. I was trying to be as best as possible a round peg and not a square peg. And as we're digging this site, we came upon what was immediately labeled the vat room, because they found this vat that you can see pointed in situ, right? So, which was very neat. And as we're excavating, I noted several things. And this is where kind of like your interdisciplinary eyes really helps. I said, this is an incredibly clean room for archaeology. And that might not be enough for an archaeologist that's traditionally trained just to stop and say, okay, whatever, they'll probably overlook it. But then I saw other clues. There's like a workbench with like cutting and pounding tools, and the floors, I mean, for Bronze Age standards, that's a very clean room. The floor is very clean. And the vat kind of looked a little suspicious to me because there were many shirts inside of it. But the director said to me, Andrew, you're wasting your time on this. It's a wine vat. In fact, we found some wine vessels next door. So why bother with this? So building up some goodwill, surveying for him, and so on and so forth, doing things that he needed me to do, I asked him, it's not going to cut into that time, but after hours, can I collect samples and just for kicks, take them back to Philadelphia and analyze them? He said, sure, as long as it's on your time, so on and so forth. So I never imagined a dissertation would come out of it. I thought it would just be interesting to do. So I took the samples, and from the get-go, he said, it's just going to show that it's wine, which is okay, interesting, but nothing to dwell upon. So what I did was I really tried hard to look for wine. But again, that's not obviously good science. You should let the data speak to you. That was my first lesson right off the bat. And what I found out was that there was zero evidence for wine. No tartaric acid, no syringic acid, malvidine, so on and so forth. Instead, I found all these other ingredients, including trace amounts of what we would call aromatics, roughly. And then what became clear is that it's what has been known in this field of Minoan archaeology for over a century, what's called a perfumed oil workshop. This was a term invented in the very early days of archaeology there, in the days of Sir Arthur Evans and Carl Blegen, these pioneers of Minoan archaeology. So again, this is an early lesson in that you need evidence and insight from many different perspectives, because you had the chemical ingredients, but then we had standing on the shoulder of these giants who basically discovered the earliest written examples of Greek, right, called Linear B. There's these famous perfumed oil tablets, right? And that's when this seemed to coincide with that. They've never found a so-called perfumed oil workshop. We know it exists because in addition to it being written in these tablets, there are depictions of as the wonderful, beautiful flyer put out by the Frankie program. You might have seen the saffron collector. So there's examples of people picking ingredients, and even, especially in Egypt, slightly different, but they're making these kind of perfumed oils. So we know about this tradition from this exact same time period, and then I could connect the dots, extrapolate, and then be able to nail down where these chemical compounds come from. That's the most difficult thing, because there's many options. You got to know the local flora, you got to know, like the chemistry has to make sense, the botany has to make sense, so on and so forth. So the tablets gave me clues what ingredients there might be. Like coriander is used as an astringent, right? Because olive oil doesn't naturally receive scents. So I was able to reconstruct basically how this might all work. There's all these other clues, right? One of the plants, Cistus criticus, is mentioned by the father of ancient history, Herodotus, and mentions, in an ethnographic fashion what it's all about. And then related to the flyer photo, right near there's this depiction that people always kind of thought it might be Cretan rock rose, it might be another plant. But again, it's a two-way street. By me discovering this, then the people doing more art historical endeavors are saying we're more confident that it's in fact Cistus criticus. So that's kind of neat. And going back to my original point, it's still Cistus criticus, or at least a species of cistus that grows in Morocco, believe it or not, is still used to make Chanel No. 5 and things like that. So I thought that was really interesting. So I thought it fits, but you see already here, and in retrospect, I thought I had to be more careful because I was, in fact, also, it's helpful to have this previous scholarship, but also you can see I was leaning towards something aromatic and more cosmetic because they called it a perfumery workshop. So this is going to be like lesson 2 that I'm going to find later on. Because what I found out is the ingredients don't quite overlap perfectly what we would call a perfume today. But you can even see the original scholar, Cynthia Shelmerdine, in '85, she translated this Linear B a certain way. This is an example where interpreting it can be tricky, right? This isn't something canonical like Euripides or Virgil or something like that. These are just tablets that nobody else are going to read. So she translated it with that perfume angle as well because that's what people were saying 100 years ago, saying this is a perfume oil industry. But you see, and then later on, Tom Palaima, who is a MacArthur winner for his work with Linear B, so he's the best of the best, right? Translated slightly different. But what I would argue is that he is not a chemist, right? So for instance, he put down unguent, which means that it's solid at room temperature. And based upon the evidence I've gathered from not just the site in East Crete, but elsewhere, it's clear almost certainly that it was never a fat-based, or something like that, a solid at room temperature. So even though he might be the best translator of Linear B, he's absolutely wrong if he understands the technical terms as they're defined today. So again, this might sound like an exercise in hubris, but it shows you the power of interdisciplinarity, where we work together and we can inform each other. So without the science backing me, I would not do this. But in essence, I'm saying, well, there's another way to probably translate it, right? So I'm trying to veer us away from perfumes because, as I'll show you in a second, the ingredients suggest, the evidence suggests, for instance, this isn't a normal vat. You can see this weird spout in front. And in fact, it's more pharmacopoeic in nature, right? And it's certainly not an unguent. It's something like an ointment. The literal translation is oil boiler. And I could say for the purpose, it's infusing because of the evidence I've gathered from this archaeological context. I tested 80 vessels. There's no sign of burning on this vat. It's clear that the burning is happening in a room next door with these cooking pots. And here it's kind of in this big vat, they're infusing it. So anyway, the science, again, is informing the translation. And I met Tom at a conference. I was like, oh my gosh, he's going to say, what are you doing? But he said, no, keep doing this. This is incredibly helpful for people like me. The science helping the more humanistic endeavors. And lest you think this is a one-off deal, another example, again, sounds like an exercise in hubris, but I found evidence for different storax resins. And in fact, based upon the description of the father of natural history, Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, it's clear that when he was describing his inferior and superior storax in Latin, that he's actually almost certainly describing 2 different species, right? Things like that. So I actually went back to the Pliny and told my Latinist friend that he actually, it's not even that people are translating wrong in the modern day, but actually Pliny is misunderstanding it because he has different sources. He's presuming it's from the same plant and it's just better qualities, but in fact they're coming from different plants. So that's the kind of information we can give. Why did I start veering more towards pharmacology? Because in this very same perfumed oil workshop, there were copious amounts of ferulic acid. And at first you can think it comes from giant fennel, but again, that's not really aromatic of that sort, and it doesn't really have a property like coriander to being astringent. In fact, it's really either, if you're going with giant fennel, it's culinary, and it definitely isn't a kitchen. So then all of a sudden, what I thought about is the fact that other species of Ferula, besides giant fennel, have very pharmacological properties that are still front and center in this region of the world. On top of that, this is where the transdisciplinary approach comes in. There's a society in modern day now Libya. The entire city-state was founded on this one commodity they had called silphium. It was so important that they harvested it to extinction, so we can talk about ancient ecology now. The last example supposedly was presented to the Emperor Nero as a curiosity because it was the last example, and they had leveraged it to extinction. So this society, their coins were based upon this Ferula plant, and it was more valuable than gold. And the fascinating thing about it is it's one of those instances where Pliny is usually very verbose about and specific about the purpose of these plants to the point of being speculative. What's fascinating is he doesn't really talk too much about it, as you can see in this quote. So you've got to do other research, and what you find out is when they're referencing silphium, like Ovid, another author, says something like, if those two keep it up, they're going to need some silphium, right? So what we realized based upon Asafoetida in the modern day, so on and so forth, and other studies done in the last centuries, people have claimed I believe it's probably, at least in human history, the strongest abortifacient, right, in quantities enough. Unless you think I'm being speculative because Cyrene occurs some centuries later than the workshop I studied. In the room next door to the perfumed old workshop, we found a seal. And this was excavated not in recent memory, but by the original excavator, Richard Seeger, in the early 20th century. And people were like, what is this seal doing here? Because it's a silphium seed. So it raised all these questions. Silphium wasn't really supposed to be used until centuries later from this time period. Silphium's only supposed to grow in in Cyrenaica, the modern coast of Libya. So there are all these questions, but all of a sudden the evidence. So this makes me more confident that there might have been some kind of silphium used in this workshop because of this additional evidence. And on top of that, I think it also opens the possibility that this isn't just simply an aromatic cosmetic facility. So then I started to rethink how to approach this. So with those lessons I learned around 20 years ago, just fast forwarding over a lot of years of trying to figure this all out, that led me here to New Haven and the Yale Ancient Pharmacology program. But you can see the pillars of my research are based upon that original work of approaching it from different angles, relying upon a more social science approach in ethnography, the science, and then the technology, and also including the ethnography, of course, are the humanistic approaches with texts. And you can see being based at the Peabody Museum is a fantastic thing because I could walk down the hall, I could talk to Patrick Sweeney, reference the wonderful herbarium there. I could walk down to mineralogy, talk about petrography and all those other kind of things, and of course the vast anthropological division as well. With this millions of objects, I could start studying these things. And as you can see in the lower right, these wonderful students coming from all kinds of backgrounds. I mean, biochemistry to classics to NELC and everything else in between. So working with them to try to figure out some of these mysteries. How do I go about doing this? Data is really the most important thing, as you can imagine, from all different angles. And we need robust data, kind of a two-pronged approach. Both legacy collections, which is abundant here at Yale, millions of objects just waiting to be studied. As we were just talking about earlier on, there are untold amounts of pottery from Dura Europus. Never will be displayed. They're not pretty, but they're incredibly interesting to my eyes because they're still in their original bags, all dirty. That's what I need to get the organic sample. So it's going to be overlooked by most art historians probably, if not all. But then there's incredible data in there for me. But you also need new field work, right? Especially things like ethnobotany, so on and so forth. So we kind of have that approach, and we have these collaborations. So in the title I mentioned cross-campus. One of the nodes of research is my ethnohistory team, and we work closely with the Yale Babylonian Collection. And this is an example of a mystery that we've somewhat solved. I mean, this is a vessel from the days of J.P. Morgan, inscribed with the great king of Persia, the Achaemenids, Xerxes. And people could have speculated, where they're from. They're exceedingly rare and only found in the most elite of contexts, the tomb of Mausolus, the namesake of mausoleums, so on and so forth. And the Yale Babylonian Collection has an amazing intact piece that's on display now, or will be soon, in the new exhibit at the museum. We did these studies, and they contain opiates, right? So we can start thinking what they're doing here. And we can kind of extrapolate that. So in King Tut's tomb, this was a mystery never solved, but people don't realize that King Tut's tomb was looted twice. The first time it was looted, they took barely anything. We think some metals, things that are portable, and then they fled. The second looting incident was much more systematic. They left all the portable jewels and gold and things like that. In fact, what they took was, this is the vessel you see here is maybe like the volume of a soda can, something like 330 milliliters. These vast pharaonic versions of this vessel, right, at the height of ancient Egypt's power, there are dozens and dozens of these calcite jars that was filled with the same kind of brown substance. And in that second looting incident, all but two of these jars, they put them into sacks. You can see still the finger marks from these large calcite vessels. And we know they put them in sacks because they looted it so hastily, they left one of them, and there were remnants of this sack with this brown stuff in it. So never studied, and part of the narrative of King Tut's tomb that's never been talked about, right? The fact that of all the treasures they could have stolen, more than the first slight looting incident, their main concern was getting probably opiates. So fascinating. We're also working with the archaeology department because what we do, since it's about landscapes also, the ecology, so we have these wonderful people. The Yale Center for Earth Observation is helping us doing multispectral analysis. And as I'll talk about more in a second, there's an island off the coast here owned by the museum, and it allows us to do all these kind of interesting studies that are trying to push the envelope of the data we could get. But there's a parallel plan, like I said, with the field work. So we're working with the Thebes Museum. They're wonderful. George Serimes in the lower right is the director of the Yale Hellenic Studies program, so working with him as well, because again, there's this ethnographic component that he's been incredibly helpful with. And working with the locals hand in hand. And then we have, for instance, the ethnobotany angle here at the Yale Herbarium, as I mentioned. Patrick Sweeney. I mean, there are specimens from over 150 years ago collected by the founder of the herbarium. So wonderful access to things like here, very early grapes. And there's a parallel in Greece, where with the locals we're collecting the very plants mentioned by these ancient authors that were supposed to cure all kinds of different things. Absolutely fascinating. So for instance here, Hellebores Niger, the individual there, he said, well, for you guys, this is one species to you, but the way we've learned it, and I believe it is, we have 7 different valleys where we've categorized 7 different versions of this plant. I mean, he's not saying it's a subspecies or anything like that, but clearly as they understand it, they call it, the local ecologies are that specific, the soils, so on and so forth. So we're starting to investigate these kind of things. I mean, there are legends written by these ancient historians about these plants. So we're starting to try to get to the bottom of this. And having the Medical Historical Library here is absolutely amazing. They have one of less than 50 facsimiles of what I think is probably my favorite ancient document, the Vena Dioscorides, the Nicaea Juliana Codex. The original, of course, is in Vienna, and it was written 1,500 years ago for, you can't make this stuff up, for a Roman princess who then got married into the power of the time, the Byzantine Empire, and that royal family. She brought it to Constantinople, modern Istanbul, where sometime, during her lifetime or shortly afterwards, she gifted it to the Imperial Hospital in Constantinople. And most important for my research, then for 1,000 years plus, it was used as a guide for actual practitioners of of medicine, pharmacy, so on and so forth, eventually given to the Sultans after the Ottomans took over Constantinople, the Sultan's Jewish physician, who then, and then after him, it got gifted to, I think, a Flemish diplomat who gifted it to the Holy Roman Emperor. That's how it got to Vienna. But you can see here in the right, it's remarkable because that center portion, so this portion is the original 1st century text of De Materia Medica, right? Dioscorides, the author himself, has an incredible story, which I won't get into here, but you can see all the different hands. It's not, so the original text is Byzantine Greek. A lot of the scholia is Greek because that was used in Constantinople, but you'll also note there's a scholia, marginalia in Turkish, Arabic, Hebrew, a slew of others, Persian, and in fact, one of my students who's looking at analysis, there's actually a Germanic, or very early Germanic writing on it, probably done in Vienna. So it's absolutely astounding, and there really is no translations of this scholia. My students love this because the closest example, it's fiction, is really the Harry Potter Potions Manual. So if you guys know that story, right? The value was not really, if you know the narrative, it's not in the original text, but it's with Professor Severus Snape, right, as I understand it, putting all these notes in. This is how you cut this plant. Don't use that plant, use the side of a knife. And that's exactly what the Vienna Discourse is all about. And we're just starting to plumb those depths because it falls through the cracks. Who's going to study it? Is a botanist going to study it? Is a classicist going to study it? Is a NELC scholar going to study it? The fact of the matter is, and I can so relate to this book, it very much falls through the cracks, and we're just starting to explore it. For instance, as the herbarium director told me, it was made for a princess. It's so accurate, the illustrations, you can identify species. So all of a sudden, these, again, going back to translate, we don't know what plant this is in the linear B text. All of a sudden, we can say, well, at least in this time period, we know what species, we can identify the species of plant, and we know what the Greek says. So at least we can put in that moment, this was their understanding of how they identified a plant. First time ever. But nobody's really, maybe someone's thought about doing it, but you can see the difficulties, in fact, of actually putting the expertise together to do it. When I asked the Medical Historical Library, how does this book exist here? Because there's 5 books in the original. It's exquisite, accurate facsimile made in 1970 to the point that you can still see the bloody fingerprints. It's the exact same size, so on and so forth. It took separate library endowments to buy each book. I can't imagine what the cost was in 1970. But it surprised me that 4 of the books were never opened, and then you still have the little, endowed by this family or that family was never attached. So I asked the staff there, like, why did you buy this and who is this for? And then they paused for a second. They said, apparently it was purchased for you. That was a really nice sentiment. It only took 50 years. I'm glad they purchased it. So again, we're connecting to these oral histories. We're working with the local people. And we're working towards the first purpose-built lab for ancient pharmacology. So this is a photo of our pied-à-terre in the basement of the museum right now. Great space, but we actually want to make, we're renovating a 1,600 square foot modular lab in West Campus where all this can happen in one location. And again, this wouldn't happen without the wonderful students. So Ria Singh was a first-year student in the collection of the Peabody Museum seminar. And she gamely joined the team, and she's doing this wonderful work, ethnobotanical work with another mystery we solve. It's a whole other talk, but we solved this mystery of what this installation in what is now the border of Egypt and Sudan was all about. It was a wine installation. And she's helping me look at the earlier plants I showed you, these specimens of the different Vitis plants in the herbarium, and we're connecting those dots. So as I kind of happily say, if a student joins my lab, they're certainly going to work, with the primary research mission. And then our last angle, of course, is the technological angle, because it's a ton of data. How do you deal with terabytes and terabytes of information? And of course, right in-house at the museum, we have the informatics division led by Nelson Rios and others. So it's just been a wonderful luxury to have all these specialists helping us. Just very quickly, the way I want to end is I do want to cite this challenge that we're facing in case there are archaeologists in the room, aspiring archaeologists. we're dealing with a 150-year plus tradition of how to do archaeology. So this is from just 2 looted tombs. We need to get data, but at the same time, the way it works now, for better or worse, is that you want to find spectacular things typically, right, to get grants. You want to find palaces, so on and so forth. The way that we frame the project now, the program, it allows us the luxury of being more strategic. Because if you want to do this right, this is just from one rescued tomb. You can imagine how many millions of sherds are coming out. This wasn't even our rescue excavation. That's from a previous rescue, and they're asking us to study it. So if you indiscriminately do archaeology as traditionally done, we're talking about decades of commitment. And so we've tried to think of a different way to do it. So one way to do it differently is rather than showing up, all jet lagged in Greece and just taking days to set up, we train our students on Horse Island, as I mentioned. And they do exactly everything we would do in Greece, from the ethnobotanical, specimens to the UAV techniques. So they were surprised this past summer, the first time we did this, is because our students hit the ground running. They knew exactly what to do, and it was the best compliment that the local authorities gave is, how are they just on the fly doing this? There's usually like a training process, a feeling out process, and I explained to them this wonderful resource that the Peabody Museum has provided to save us that time. Because many of our students have internships to go to. They have senators to intern for, and they want to go work at the London School of Economics or CERN. So we squeeze this in a very tight season, typically less than a month in May and June before they have to go off to their internships. So just very quickly, this is really another talk for another time, and I want to wrap up here soon. But these are just the goals that, for this audience, for the most part, it'll seem pretty innocuous. But when archaeologists typically see this, I presented this at the Archaeological Institute of America conference early this month, and people said, on one hand, I can't believe you're doing this, I had to do it. And on the other hand, they were saying this has been a long time coming because we need a sustainable model in terms of doing archaeology. How do we do it in situ? How do we do it without having millions of objects sitting in our collections, gathering dust not looked at for a century? So prioritizing this approach, being very targeted, looking at microclimates in collaboration with the locals, and finally making it sustainable, which is a very tall order. So just to sum up, it's now time for some glamour shots, if you'll amuse me. So believe it or not, this is not something that we kind of front load, because maybe in a more traditional dig, they would do it. It's kind of cool. We're digging Homeric sites, right? Most of you probably, of course, know the Iliad, but these are somewhat obscure sites, but we're confident that we've identified these 2 sites correctly. So it's in this region of southern focus. We're on the PI. It's near the ancient site of Delphi, but it's overlooked because it's overshadowed by this classical, very famous classical sanctuary of the oracle there. But we wanted to go before even Delphi was really even a site. This was centuries before. So the Homeric, the Bronze Age period. And it's cloaked in legend and all kinds of myths. I mean, Mount Helicon, the land of the Muses, where I collected that hellebore, by the way, which is so cool. And of course, Delphi is nearby, but also the site that we're going to work at. That's where Mark Antony mustered his troops and got grain before he fought at Actium with Cleopatra. I mean, crazy things have happened here, the histories. So this is nearby is where King Philip and Alexander subdued the local populace to become the rulers of the ancient Greek world and start the Hellenistic period all the way to South Asia, so on and so forth. So incredible history that we're working at. So you can see our site up, that's Mount Parnassus, another very famous mountain in the region. Kind of like the start of the Balkans there. We're at that zone. A very sleepy village, no tour buses come here, unlike very nearby. Delphi is just off here to the side across the valley. And this is a site most of you probably know. Many of you probably have been to Delphi. Our site is this mountain range, so across this valley. but we're concentrating on this area because of a couple reasons. One, it's overlooked, but this is where a lot of it's a cool story. I won't get into it too much. But for instance, Hippocrates' ancestor supposedly used that hellebore to subdue a nearby rival town by contaminating their water source. And apparently they all got dysentery and weakened, and they were able to subdue this neighboring city-state. So the legend goes his descendant was so despondent about this family history, he said, I gotta do something about it. And you guys can probably guess what that is. It's the Hippocratic Oath of doing, there's like many layers of history here. It's absolutely amazing. So this is the town. There's an entire Roman city underneath of Antikythera. But we're not concentrating down so much, but the periphery, incredible stuff. This is just picking stuff off the ground at our site. It both excites us and scares us, because if this is coming out of the surface, then we know that there's tremendous stuff under the ground, and that requires, again, time and expertise that we have to be very careful about, because that might take us away from our main focus, as crazy as that sounds. The authorities are like, we've never met people like you, because typically you guys just want to dig the Megaron and get all the gold. So you guys are very strange and very interesting at the same time. I take that as a compliment. We're finding bronze pins on the surface. It's incredible. So I just want to do this quick view of the site. Obviously very beautiful. You guys are welcome to visit. I know it's probably not going to be take much to convince. It's a Homeric site. It's fortified, incredible harbor. But this is Greece. It's just, I know people look at the greatest hits, the Athenian Acropolis, so on and so forth. That's one of the locals, not one of our students. Our students are down here collecting pottery. But people always say very Lord of the Rings. Never excavated, and it's a Homeric site. We're doing geomorphology. This was a peninsula at the time, but there was probably water all along this area. There's still a perennial stream here, which is very unusual for Greece. So the water source was tremendous. And then just very quickly, the work that the wonderful students are doing. This is a 3D model. With such accuracy, we can see sherds on the ground. Right? So again, trying to do things differently. And finally, I want to kind of end by pointing out, again, the history of this. There's a very famous 2nd century Greek, Romanized Greek, Pausanias. He kind of wrote the first, I don't know what the modern equivalent is. Someone in the audience can tell me. I used to say Blue Guide, but students don't know what a Blue Guide is anymore. So TripAdvisor maybe. He basically travels the countryside of Greece in the 2nd century and explains what all these sites are all about. And he mentions, for instance, in a somewhat obscure text, he's walking in this very region and he says, by the way, the most important sanctuary for the Egyptian goddess Isis is here. Me being me, you could triangulate exactly where it is. So I was here a couple years ago when I started working, and I said, what is this little pin I put in Google Maps? I looked at it, I realized I put it in over 10 years ago based upon this text saying, if you're ever in this area, look at this. And what I realized is that I'm here now, so I looked, and this site almost certainly is this temple complex of Isis, probably at least an early stage, might be a temple to Artemis, so like the bookend to the sanctuary of Apollo, just on the other side of this valley. If you guys know legends, just underneath here, that's where Oedipus killed his biological father. You can't, again, make this stuff up. It's just steeped in history. And what's interesting is the references to this site. Pausanias goes on and on about it. It's a mystery, so it can't go into too many details, but it's clear people came here to get healing. Roman emperors came here to get healed. Never been excavated, so again, a very interesting site for us to do our type of research to try to figure out what kind of medical approaches might they have been using 2,000 years ago. So just in the time we have, I think I have a couple minutes, so you can see how breathtaking it is. So this is never excavated. And the reason why the grass is, there's actually audio. One of my students made it. There's so much marble here, the soil is so poor, that's why there's probably grass growing there. That's Parnassus, Delphi's just down the road here. My previous EVST 40 student in the first year seminar at the Peabody Museum, he got a UAV license, and he's the one that did this. So wonderful students. A beautiful landscape. So this is going to be one of our goals for, oh, by the way, we're flying it from here. Thank goodness for the Germans building these power supplies, but they make roads where we can actually do this kind of survey work. And there's the site. Almost certainly the original site, the upper Acropolis with all the temples, and beneath it there was probably a whole complex of medical treatments. But nobody traditionally in archaeology is interested in excavating a medical complex, right? So I sure am. So that's kind of where the future is leading. And now the question is, what are the future discoveries, both here at Yale, but also overseas? Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for this utterly fascinating talk. I think we are open for Q&A. Would you be open
Of course,
for
yeah.
questions?
I'll be
from
happy
the
to
audience? Yeah.
take any questions.
Yeah.
I know it's a lot. There's a lot of information, so.
Thank you so much for a great talk. I'm a forest ecologist, so I work in the modern day, but I'm very curious on when you're looking at plant species that were present in those areas and looking at medicinal uses, what evidences you found for trade routes or changes in climate and things like that have affected both locally available plants, but also plants that were coming from abroad.
That's a great point. What's interesting about plants such as black hellebore is that at least the ancient authors from this time period, and again, you gotta always vet them and see how much they actually knew, they claim what made this area of Antikythera special was these plants, right? And they only grew here. I mean, what does it mean only grew? Is it the specific type of class of these plants that they imagined? Because we know black hellebore occurs elsewhere as well, right? So that once again is why after a 10, 20-year journey, when the opportunity come to Yale, arrived at, just fortuitous came up to me. I was at MIT at the time, which is great, but obviously in terms of the humanistic opportunities there, they're much more limited. All the humanities and social sciences are basically in one building and on the other side of the track, so it made it difficult for me to collaborate with them. But these are the exact questions that we're trying to get to. So that's why I don't just invite archaeology students or classicists or NELC students to work, but the fact that the School of Environment is so closely linked to the museum, the director, Dave Skelly, being a part of the school, that was highly attractive to me because looking at people doing green chemistry or the work that you're doing, my original GIS mentor, Dana Tomlin in Philadelphia at Penn, he's now here at Yale. And he was is inspirational because in the 70s, he and a whole bunch of his peers, remarkably, can you imagine the 70s, they helped basically invent GIS, right? I mean, they ended up, he's the only one that stayed in higher education. The rest went on to establish Esri, Idrisi, and all kinds of other places. So I knew that it was possible at Yale, and that's exactly why I'm here for that reason, to start delving into these very questions of ecology. I didn't get into it, but this site itself is actually the sister site to the coastal site. And what's neat is we're starting to take cores and things like that because there was a lake nearby. So just thinking about this fourth dimensionally in terms of time and everything else like that, nearby is a very famous basin, the Capais Basin, where in this time period, it was swampy, they drained the entire land, and it's clear at the collapse of the Bronze Age, probably a neighboring town stuffed their drain hole and then it got swampy again. And to show you that accomplishment that was done in, let's say, the 14th century BCE, the Romans, everybody else tried, just like with the canal at Corinth, they tried repeated attempts to complete this very ambitious engineering work. It wasn't until first the French helped, so it wasn't drained again until the 19th century, in the modern day. So there's all these questions. We're collecting data. We've taken cores in the sea to look at the pollen record and other things like that. But the reason why I love doing this with an audience like this is because then we start getting ideas, and it's, like I said, it's about collaboration. So we eventually we are doing now, we're inviting all kinds of scholars. There's opportunities, as you can imagine, for as one administrator put it, there might be somebody from any division, department in the university that could go there and find something to do. Paleontology, there's fossils just coming out everywhere. So it's a remarkable opportunity, and definitely ecology is a major part of what we're trying to look at.
Yes, thank you. Fascinating talk. Wonder if DNA is preserved. I presume it is preserved. And if DNA analysis would inform your work and your findings.
This is why I love being here, because as you might know, there was a major study done with the Max Planck Institute, with the Harvard study of the human past, David Reich over in the med school. They've done some ancient DNA studies, but typically, of course, with human remains. And one of the things I knew from what I heard, like for instance, when ESC was founded here, they had some kind of pioneering DNA lab, which is now, I think, down in the med school. But certainly, when I started taking soil samples and other things like that, starting to see where people are with this type of research, there are incredible, besides just pollen cores, looking for pollen and phytoliths and so on and so forth. I think certainly that's a very promising angle. And of course, one of the reasons why I'm in Greece is that they are collaborative in ways. Archaeology is so important to them. It's both a pro and a con, right? Because they are so powerful. It's arguably the most important branch of their government because of the 40% of their income comes from tourism, as you might know. So it could create a certain kind of bureaucracy, but at the same time, people don't ask questions when it comes to the science part. They absolutely want the best science to be done. And an example of that is in it's not necessarily good or bad, but it's the system. Over in Italy, you can't really sample or study, even if you want a UAV photogrammetry scan an invertebrate paleontology sample, they won't, from what I heard, the Italian government system is such that you can't do it. I proposed that in Parnassus. It's like an up zone, and they actually said to me, why do you want us to just scan it? Why don't you we'll chop it and we'll give it to you and you can take it to New Haven. We're like, okay, that we probably don't want to do that, but that shows you how collaborative and cooperative they are. I love working in Egypt. I love my colleagues there, but they have a strict rule. Even if it's a toy under 250 grams, which is the definition of, I think, in the field, in this technology, UAV technology with how the world recognizes it, you can't fly a single UAV in Egypt. And our collaborators, Nadine Mueller and Nelk and Greg, her co-director there, they're having a heck of a time. Like, how do you actually basically not have this major technology in archaeology? I mean, we're doing thermal imaging, we're doing multispectral analysis, going back to the ecology of it. It's absolutely, as I pointed out, the multispectral work that we're testing out in Horse Island and we're starting to use in Greece. We're happily sharing this technology and information and data with all the faculty and collaborators in Greece, and almost exclusively, this is very interesting, it's not the archaeologists that want the data, it's all the scientists that want it. So that's neat to me, that I'm very flattered and humble that the archaeologists, we work with archaeologists, but the scientists are perhaps the most excited over in Greece about this, which is neat. But DNA, yeah, we want to get there too, because you're absolutely right. I know what you're thinking about with the plants and the Vienna Dioscorides, but you've read my mind that that's certainly an angle we want to pursue.
So some of the compounds that modern pharmacologists study
Sure.
Came from ethnopharmacologists or people who, even amateurs who just go around the world trying to sample drugs that people are taking now.
That's right.
And I'm just wondering, in any of the locations where there's archaeologically interesting chemical use. Are there any remnants of that among the local populations in terms of, plants that people use for various? Usually, it's something that has an effect on the brain. Those are the things that people tend to pick up
That's
on.
the thing. It's like one of the things I think we're doing is that just like when you look at the Vina Dioscorides, we say book 5 is about food. Book one part of it is about psychedelics. These are modern terms. Like it's clear that they kind of loosely put them into these books, but they didn't mean to categorize it that distinctly, right? These are just organics you consume and it somehow affects your body. I'm not saying that we should get rid of categories in the modern day, but I'm just proposing maybe we've got to kind of think outside the box a little bit and think about how all of these things, like how do our modern systems and sensibilities affect the way that we interpret it and look at these things. What I'm trying to get back to, an example of what you just mentioned, is that in south of our site, in the Peloponnese there, in Arcadia, up in the hills, that's often where the interesting information comes from. I still remember this, and I'm going to try to go back to it because I was just passing through there, and I was kind of doing this kind of research. I didn't have a program, again, a square peg, trying to figure out which department I was going to be in. And we met a local and said, "Oh, my family for centuries was doing what you would call maybe pharmacology." So she said, "You want to see it?" So I went to their shop, and there's newspaper on the frosty glass. It's probably hadn't been used for a generation. She lets me in. It took my breath away because it's probably maybe something more along the lines of what we call like an apothecary. So the beautiful wooden shelves and everything else like that, the beautiful glass jars, and now it kind of, I got to get back there, and I'm not sure. I'm not holding out hope anything's still there, but all the glass jars were labeled in a beautiful, more modern Greek script, and then they specifically labeled not just how they viewed it as a substance, but also there were details about what plants, where they collected it from, and I'll give you. I don't usually like to kind of be a downer, but let me just share you, where is that, if I can find that. So I knew there is a sense of urgency. Like I don't like to necessarily push people to scare them, but I'll give you an example. So these 3 individuals, they lived up in that mountain village, and we did an interview with them, and they're telling us all this information. "Oh, you're looking for this?" They loved us, but they're like, nobody in the younger generation is really all that interested in this kind of research. So we videotaped it with their consent. We wrote it all down. This is just a start. We're going to get all this great information. 2018, that winter, all 3 of them passed away. That's what's going on. And we thought all was kind of lost. And what ended up happening was, I showed you that earlier picture with the gentleman. We had the sample of black hellebore, and by some miracle, we found him. He's actually the grandson of the individual in the middle. And he said, he's in his 60s, and he said, "Look, I'm the last, at least in this area. I think I'm gonna be alive for a number more of winters, but if you're gonna do this and get information from me, it's the time now. I'm not sure if I'm gonna live." He's like 68 or something like that, right? And he said there's a sense of urgency. So that's why I realized I need this team of research assistants. We're going to go there this summer, for instance, and we're going to go to every single valley he points out and document in every fashion possible. And you can imagine we have support at the highest levels from the Greek ministries, because they understandably know that we're passionate about this, but also working with the locals. They again, this is not something that you got to be worried about, but there's a certain relationship between foreign institutions of archaeology. Foreign institutions like the American School has been working there since the 19th century. Let's just say there's a certain relationship that's developed since in 150 years, and that's kind of the status quo. So when we come in and we work in the way we do, as I pointed out, the locals are absolutely, one, flabbergasted, but obviously they're very supportive of what we do, because we work hand in hand with the locals. I don't think I'm being that quote unquote disruptive. I'm just doing it the way I think it should be done. So, yep. That's a great question. We're trying.
I was very curious because there are these traditions, current practice traditions like Ayurveda, which is really based on plant science, and there are treatises on which. Similarly, I wonder, right? I mean, I have heard in India there is a scheme of medicine called Unani medicine, which is Greek.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was curious whether these modern alternative practices actually also contain some of the information that you're looking for, or do you think these are actually too contaminated by now over time?
The way I explain it is I view all data as valuable data. And you're absolutely correct. Like, people ask me, why did you major in biophysics and classics and NELC? And this probably wouldn't surprise many of you. Bluntly, my parents would have killed me if I majored in classics, as I was pre-med. So it was kind of it was détente, right? So it thrilled me when my student Ria, who you met doing the ethnobotany, she's from South Asia, and she was just FaceTiming with her parents, and they were like, "Oh, you're working in the lab. Is your professor there or your director?" And she said, "Yeah." So I talked to them, and they were so thankful, because if just to be again very honest, my parents would be like, "Ethnobotany, like what are you doing here?" But her parents were like so thankful, saying, and they're explaining to me all these traditions, and I said, "We're absolutely going to pursue that." And that's why we need people from all over the world who are international, because we're going to pursue those things. It's a wealth of information because.
Are there surviving such traditions in Greece? I mean, is there?
There often is, but it's missed, right? Like if people aren't catching, and I'm not saying that they can do everything, but it's just where people are focusing now in these traditions that have been established, like the classics. No one reads really the Vienna De Materia Medica, so on and so forth. Another quick example, which is remarkable, is the last generation who spoke the native Mayan language. They also, of course, knew the Mayan language, but they learned Spanish and Latin. So this is the first interface between the worlds. And there's this wonderful, beautiful book. It surprised me even more in a sense than the Vienna Discordies, because I had no idea this book existed. It was lost for centuries, right? It was written, it's similar to the Vienna Discordies. It's talking about all the plants in the Americas and so on and so forth. Then it was sent and eventually landed in the Vatican Library, where it was forgotten for centuries. Until the 1930s, the Pope gifted it to Mexico. And there was one translation done then, and then it was forgotten again. So that's a parallel example where we're looking at these traditions, and then we're talking to the locals. And what's also remarkable is that for our herbarium here is very strong in the Americas. And all of a sudden, it's like a bridge. But we're going to collect more specimens with the collaboration of the Greeks to add to our herbarium. But it's another base of operations because there's lots of parallels. So it sounds ambitious, and we're very sensitive to that. We want to make sure what we do is achievable as much as possible. But again, this is why we love talking to different units, whether it's people that focus on South Asia or Central America, so on and so forth. That's a great point, though. Yeah.
I recall that there was a substantial medical establishment in what is now called Pergamum in Turkey. Mm-hmm. And I wondered whether that being substantially later than Bronze Age place, but I wondered whether there was any information there, and if there is, or interest in your approach, whether the Turkish government is in any way helpful.
Well, that's a great point, because of course Pergamon was where Galen operated from, who was a very famous physician whose treatises were used until fairly modern days. So next to the Isaion where we're working is the Asclepion, of course. And that's exactly, of course, the context in Pergamon that Galen was operating in. Again, one of these leading edge medical facilities at the time. Of course, the library was considered only only second to the Library of Alexandria, of course. What we think is clearly Dioscordes had access to the Library of Alexandria and maybe at Pergamon, because he comes from what's today like southeast Turkey. And it just so happens in September I was at the modern, what's called in the modern day Kohltepe, Kanesh, which is a very famous site there. Gojko Baramovich, who is an Assyriologist at Harvard and married to our curator here, was kind enough to take me around after this event in Eleusis in Greece. Remarkable. And what, again, broke my heart in a good way was we're sitting there at Kohltepe, and the director of Fikri says, "Oh, you're interested in this kind of stuff? You know, like right over that hill is where Dioscordes grew up and lived." And he's like, "You want to go there now?" And we're like, "Look, we're gonna get to the airport," and just like, so one day. But he said, "Oh, if you want," again, working with locals is so important, because he said, I know Turkey has some different rules, and they were at our ACER meeting going around saying, "We know that the rules have been kind of draconian of late." The consulate showed up and said, "Please, we've loosened these rules, come and work in Turkey." Coming up to each of us. They were reading our abstracts. They came to me and said, "You're interested in pharmacology, right?" I'm like, "Yes." And they said, "Please come." So we're working with them, and Fikri said, "Look, next time you come, all those plants that Dioscordes talks about, we'll get them for you." And I thought, oh my gosh, I mean, within kilometers of where he's writing about these kind of things, right? So you can imagine. And then of course, Istanbul, Constantinople, which is where this volume was used, right, and written. I'm very thankful for the different units here, because I'm not an expert in the Turkish language, for instance, but I could go to my colleagues in NELC and you know, find somebody that knows something about something, and it kind of really supports and makes me feel good about making the move from Cambridge to New Haven for that reason.
I want to take this opportunity to thank you once more. And I think it's remarkable that a lot of big pharma companies are also in the search for new natural compounds that we can get, and they're scouring the world for indigenous knowledge. So thank you so much for what you do, and it was really exciting for us to hear about it. So let me just remind everyone